The wind had already taken the road when Eleanor Shaw stopped walking. Dust lifted around her boots, curling in the heat, and the only sound was her daughter's thin breath. She didn't speak for a while, just stared at the stretch of land ahead like it might finally give her permission to rest. "Keep moving, Mama?" Maggie's voice was soft, but there was a tremor there. Eleanor nodded, though her knees ached and her throat was cracked dry. She'd learned long ago that if you stop too long, folks start looking. And if they look, they start remembering. They'd left Willow Creek with nothing but a sack of clothes and the kind of silence that comes after too much talk behind closed doors. "A widow who thinks she's still got pride," they'd said. The words stuck like burrs. Her husband's death had already made her small in their eyes. But the whisper of scandal, the one she never could wash away, had finished the job. Now, on that endless dirt road, she didn't care where she ended up. "Somewhere no one knows my name," she thought. But her heart disagreed. Her heart still wanted to belong somewhere, though she'd never admit it. When the faint rhythm of hooves reached her ears, she felt her whole body stiffen. A rider approached, tall in the saddle, coat darkened with trail dust, eyes shaded under the brim of his hat. He slowed near them, studying the pair without saying a word at first. Cale Ryder had been on this stretch of land since before the mines went quiet. He knew what it meant to see a woman standing alone with a child on a road like this. He'd seen too many not make it past the first cold night. Something in him, the part that still heard screams from the old shaft cave-in, refused to ride past. "Ma'am," he said finally, voice low and worn. "You folks lost?" Eleanor's reply came sharp. No one's lost if they weren't going anywhere to begin with. Cale almost smiled at that. Pride, he recognized it like a mirror. He'd carried his own since that night 5 years ago when the mine collapsed. He'd been the foreman then, told to check the supports one last time. He didn't, and 3 men never came home. Since then, he'd worked his land alone, spoke only when he had to, tried to earn quiet. The girl peeked from behind her mother's skirt, eyes wide but trusting. Cale tipped his hat slightly to her, then back to Eleanor. "You looking for work or just rest?" he asked. Eleanor's lips tightened. "I don't take charity." Didn't offer any. He looked toward the ridge where his cabin waited, smoke thin against the sky. "Roof leaks, stove needs fixing. Fair trade for a meal and a place to sleep." She hesitated. The road behind her felt heavier than the one ahead. Maggie tugged at her sleeve, whispering, "Please, Mama." Eleanor's breath broke a little as she exhaled. "Fine, just for the night." They followed him, distance between their steps, a woman guarding her dignity, a man guarding his guilt. Neither knew that the same kind of emptiness sat behind both hearts. When they reached the cabin, Cale handed her a bucket. "Water's at the pump," he said. Firewood stacked by the shed. He didn't offer to help, didn't speak again until later, when the lamplight drew thin shadows across the floorboards. Maggie was asleep on a blanket near the stove. Eleanor sat at the table, hands still trembling slightly though she tried to hide it. Cale poured coffee into a tin cup and set it down without looking at her. "You came from Willow Creek," he said quietly. Her head jerked up. "You know it?" "Passed through once. Folks there talk too much." Eleanor's eyes flashed, anger, shame, and something else behind them. "Then you already know why we left." He shook his head. "Don't care much about why. Just know you're here now." The words landed heavier than he meant. For a moment, neither moved. The only sound was the lamp ticking faintly as it burned low. Eleanor whispered almost to herself, "I don't belong anywhere." Cale looked at her then, steady and certain. "You do now." Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried. Inside the cabin, the silence changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It held something fragile, like the first breath after too long underwater. Eleanor didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was passing through. She just sat there, listening to the soft breath of her sleeping child, and the quiet promise in a stranger's voice she wasn't ready to believe, but couldn't quite forget either. The morning came slow, the kind that makes you think twice before moving. The air smelled of cold ashes and coffee grounds, and Eleanor woke to the soft crack of wood shifting in the stove. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then Maggie's small hand reached for her, and the cabin's quiet crept back in. Cale was already outside. She heard the creak of the pump handle, then the rhythm of water filling a bucket. The man moved like someone who'd been working alone too long, steady, precise, saying nothing he didn't need to. She wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped to the doorway. He looked up only once. "Water's warmin'. You'll need it for the dishes." Eleanor almost smiled at the assumption. No one had spoken to her like she belonged in a place in years. "We'll see to it," she said, her voice rough but polite. Inside, Maggie sat cross-legged by the stove, tracing circles in the dust. "He's nice, Mama," she said. Eleanor didn't answer right away. Nice was a dangerous word. Nice turned into hope if you weren't careful, and hope was what got you hurt. She busied herself with the kettle, scraping the blackened bottom, pretending she didn't notice the way her hands shook. When Cale came back in, the smell of morning filled the room, wood smoke, coffee, and damp leather. He set the bucket down and said, "Roof leaks a bit over the bed." "I'll patch it when I get back. You heading out?" she asked. "Fence line," he replied. "Lost a post last night," Eleanor nodded. She wanted to ask how far that was, if it was safe to stay here alone with her daughter, if this man truly meant no harm. But questions felt too much like trust, and she didn't have that to spend. He paused by the door. "You'll find flour in that tin. Bread'll keep better if you bake it dry." She looked at him then, just long enough for their eyes to meet. "I know how to make bread, Mr. Ryder." "Didn't say you didn't," he answered, and was gone. By midday, the cabin smelled of rising dough and lamp oil. Maggie hummed softly, her small voice a comfort Eleanor hadn't realized she'd missed. There was peace in motion, in cleaning, in fixing, in pretending things could be set right if your hands just kept busy. Still, the silence pressed heavy. She thought of Willow Creek, of the preacher's wife whispering behind a hymnal, of the men who stopped tipping their hats once her husband was gone, of the letter that never arrived to clear her name. Shame didn't need proof out here, it just needed someone willing to believe it. When the door opened again, sunlight spilled across the floorboards. Cale stepped in, hat in hand, shoulders dusted white with trail powder. "You got work done," he said, noticing the swept floor, the patched curtain. He looked almost startled by how different the place felt. "Work helps," she said. He nodded, quiet. "I figured you'd know that." Maggie darted to the table, holding up a small bundle. "We made biscuits," she announced proudly. Cale's face softened. "Smell good." Eleanor crossed her arms. "They'll taste better if you sit down." He hesitated, as though the invitation carried more weight than it should. Then he pulled out a chair. The three of them ate in an uneasy rhythm, no laughter but no distance either. Just the sound of forks against tin and wind slipping through the cracks. When Maggie wandered off to nap, Eleanor rose to clear the table. "We won't stay long," she said quietly. "You've done enough." Cale leaned back, eyes on the window. "You'll stay till you decide where you're going next. Ain't charity. Call it trade." She turned to him. "Trade for what?" "For peace of mind," he said simply. "It's been a long time since I've had company that didn't come with a bottle." For a moment she wanted to thank him. But something in her chest tightened, the memory of being grateful before, only to have it twisted against her. She pressed her lips together and said nothing. He stood, pulling on his coat. "Town'll talk," he said matter of fact. "They always do. Don't let it bother you." Her eyes followed him. "You think I care what folks say?" He met her gaze. "No, I think you care too much." The words hit harder than she expected. He didn't mean them cruelly. That almost made it worse. When he left again, the door closed soft, like a breath. Eleanor stood for a long time staring at that door. She'd walked miles trying to leave her past behind. But somehow, in this quiet cabin, surrounded by a stranger's kindness, the past was closer than ever, like it had followed her here just to see if she'd finally stop running. Outside, the wind rose and the sound of a hammer echoed faintly from the field. Inside, the kettle began to whistle, and Eleanor whispered to herself, "Don't start hoping now." But even she could hear it, the thin thread of warmth slipping through her voice. Something was changing, and she didn't know whether to fear it or hold on. Rain came before dawn. Soft at first, like fingertips on the roof, then steady enough to wake Eleanor. She lay there listening, Maggie curled against her side, the scent of damp earth seeping through the cracks. It had been weeks since they'd felt safe enough to sleep this soundly. She almost didn't want to move, but she knew comfort was a fragile thing, and fragile things never stayed long. By the time she rose, Cale was already outside. Through the window, she saw him in the gray light, shoulders bent against the drizzle, mending the fence line that ran down toward the creek. He hadn't asked for help. He never did. Still, Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out, boots sinking into the soft ground. "Rain'll ruin that patch," she called. He didn't look up, just gave a small nod. "Fence won't wait for dry weather." She almost smiled. That was Cale, steady, stubborn, the kind of man who fixed things just because they were broken, even when no one asked him to. Eleanor held the post upright as he hammered it into the mud. "You ever get tired of fixing?" she asked. He paused, leaning on the hammer. "You ever get tired of running?" She froze. The words weren't cruel, just true, the kind that hung in the air until you decided whether to deny them or not. She looked at him, then away. "Running keeps you alive," she said quietly. He nodded once. "So does stopping sometimes." For a while they worked without talking. Rain turned the dirt to clay, and their boots sank deeper with every step. When the fence finally stood straight again, Eleanor brushed her wet hair back and realized she was laughing, softly, breathlessly, like she hadn't in years. Cale watched her, that small, almost hidden smile tugging at his mouth. He said nothing, just handed her the hammer like it was something sacred. She took it, feeling oddly seen. Later in the cabin, the fire crackled low. Maggie sat cross-legged by the hearth, drawing circles on a scrap of paper Cale had found in town. "It's us," she said proudly when Eleanor leaned down. Eleanor frowned, studying the shapes. 2 tall figures, 1 small. "You forgot the horse," she teased. Maggie grinned. "That's him too," she said, pointing at the 3rd figure. "You and me and the horseman." Eleanor shook her head, but the warmth that rose in her chest stayed. She didn't want to name it. Hope had sharp edges if you held it wrong. When Cale came in, the smell of wet leather followed him. He set a small tin on the table. "Picked up something from the storehouse," he said. Inside were nails, thread, and 2 folded squares of faded fabric. "For curtains," he added when she hesitated. "Might keep the drafts out." She touched the cloth, tracing its frayed edge. "You didn't have to." "Didn't," he said. "You're the one sewing." It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd heard in a long time. They spent the evening in a quiet rhythm. Eleanor mended the torn hem of Maggie's dress, her hands moving with the surety of habit. Cale repaired the chair legs, scraping away the old glue. Every so often their eyes met, briefly, without words, like 2 travelers who'd found the same stretch of shelter and didn't want to disturb it. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. After Maggie went to bed, Eleanor stayed by the fire, staring into the embers. "You ever wish you could start over?" she asked. Cale didn't answer right away. He was sitting across from her, elbows on his knees, watching the flames dance. "Starting over's easy," he said finally. "It's forgiving yourself that takes the work." She looked at him, her throat tight. "You sound like you've tried." He met her eyes then, steady and calm. "Still trying." Silence stretched between them, soft and alive. The rain stopped altogether. Cale reached for the poker, stirring the coals until they glowed again. The orange light brushed across his face, catching the silver at his temples. Eleanor thought of Willow Creek. The gossip, the stares, the way even kindness had come with strings attached. Yet here, in this quiet cabin, every small thing Cale did seemed to mean exactly what it was. No pity, no price. "Thank you," she said softly, surprising herself. He looked up, eyes warm but unreadable. "For what?" "For not asking questions." He gave a slow nod. "Questions can wait. Coffee can't." She laughed, that sound fragile and new, and the moment stretched long enough for her to believe that maybe, just maybe, the road behind her wasn't all she had left. When the fire burned low, she lay awake, listening to the faint rhythm of his footsteps outside as he checked the barn one last time. Each step faded into the distance like a promise she wasn't ready to claim. But for the first time, she didn't feel like running. and that, she realized, was its own kind of peace. The morning of the town's charity gathering arrived clear and sharp, the kind of day that looks calm but hums with something underneath. Eleanor had baked bread at dawn, her hands steady but her stomach in knots. Maggie twirled in the skirt she'd mended herself, proud of every uneven stitch. Cale said little while saddling the wagon. His silence meant he was thinking. Too much, she guessed. Dustvale wasn't kind to strangers, but kindness had a way of wearing disguises here. As the wagon rolled down the main road, faces turned. Some nodded politely, others whispered, eyes sliding away too slow. Eleanor felt the weight of it all pressing on her shoulders. She'd carried heavier loads before: grief, loss, the ache of being judged. But this one had sharper edges. Cale noticed. "You don't have to come," he said quietly. "I've hidden enough for one lifetime," she replied, not looking at him. He gave a small nod. That was Eleanor, strong in all the ways that hurt most. At the churchyard, people moved like rehearsed shadows. Laughter in clusters, eyes that measured more than they greeted. Prudence Mallory, wrapped tight in righteousness, greeted them first. "Cale Ryder," she said, smile thin as a knife. "Didn't expect to see you bringing company." Cale tipped his hat slightly. "Everyone's welcome, Prudence." Her gaze slipped to Eleanor, appraising, pretending at kindness. "Yes, of course. Some folks do need a second chance." Eleanor's breath caught. Cale opened his mouth to speak, but she touched his sleeve lightly, a warning. She could fight her own battles. Inside the small hall, the air was thick with gossip disguised as cheer. Laughter rose and fell, followed by murmurs that bent around Eleanor's name like the wind curling around a closed door. She stood near the back, hands folded, eyes fixed on Maggie arranging biscuits at the refreshment table. Cale moved among the crowd, his presence calm but commanding. He spoke little, but every glance said enough. "I see you watching." Still, even his steadiness couldn't drown the whispers. When the preacher stood to speak, Prudence found her moment. Her voice carried sweetly, practiced. "And we must remember," she began, "that forgiveness is meant for those who truly repent. Even those who run from their past deserve to be reminded what they've left behind." The room went quiet. Heads turned, some out of curiosity, some with relief that the attention wasn't on them. Eleanor's face didn't change, but inside, something folded shut. Cale stepped forward, jaw tight. "That's enough." Prudence smiled without warmth. "Just stating a truth, Mr. Ryder. Some women bring trouble wherever they go." Eleanor drew a slow breath, forcing her voice steady. "And some people build churches just to hide inside them." A low murmur swept through the crowd. Maggie's small hand slipped into her mother's, trembling. Cale's eyes flicked between them, part pride, part fear of what might follow. Outside, the wind picked up, dust swirling through the open doorway. It felt like the whole town was holding its breath. Afterward, as they packed up the wagon, Cale tried to speak. "You didn't deserve that." Eleanor shook her head. "Doesn't matter what I deserve. Folks believe what they need to believe." He reached for her arm gently. "You can't let them chase you off again." Her voice cracked, softer than she meant it to be. "You think I'm running? Maybe I'm just tired of proving I shouldn't." The space between them filled with things unsaid, fear, pride, and something tender that neither dared name. Finally, he said, "Maybe stay a few days. Let it pass." That was the wrong thing to say. She heard it as distance, as doubt. Her chin lifted, eyes dry but bright. "A few days then." When they reached the cabin, she didn't go inside right away. She stood by the door, the lamplight spilling across her boots, and whispered, "You said I belonged." Cale couldn't find words fast enough. She gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe you were wrong." Then she walked out into the dark, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by the wind. Cale stayed where he was, listening until there was nothing left to hear but the old creak of the porch boards and the low hum of his own regret. Inside, the lamp flickered and the room felt too big again, like it had before she came. Morning came without her. Cale woke to the sound of the wind scraping across the roof, that hollow emptiness only silence could make. The chair she always used sat pushed neatly under the table. The small sewing basket was gone. He didn't need to look twice to know she'd left for good, or at least meant to. He moved slow that morning, like every step reminded him of something he hadn't said. He poured coffee but didn't drink it, stared at the steam until it vanished. The cabin felt different now, cleaner, emptier, quieter. He'd built his life around quiet, but this was something else. By mid-morning, he saddled his horse. Not to chase her, he told himself that more than once, but because there were things that needed saying, and pride had already done enough damage. Down in town, the church bell rang, calling folks to the square. It wasn't Sunday, which meant only one thing. Prudence Mallory had news. Cale tied his horse and walked up slow, eyes on the crowd gathering near the porch of the general store. Prudence's voice carried, sweet and sharp as ever. A man who hides behind good deeds is still guilty if he keeps silent about his wrongs. Her gaze slid toward him. Everyone's did. He'd spent years letting whispers pass over him, bearing one mistake under 100 right actions. But now he understood what silence cost. It cost people like Eleanor everything. He stepped forward, his boots thudding against the boards. She didn't run because of shame, he said. His voice was calm, but it cut through the noise like a whip crack. She ran because this town doesn't know the difference between sin and sorrow. Someone snorted. Another whispered, "You defending her, Ryder?" Cale's jaw tightened. "I'm telling the truth. 5 years ago, when the mine collapsed, those men didn't die by bad luck. I was supposed to check the beams. I didn't. My delay killed them. I've carried that weight ever since." The square went dead still. Even Prudence lost her voice for a moment. "I thought working hard could pay it back," he went on. "Thought keeping my mouth shut was penance. But then she came along, someone you all decided was less than you. You treated her the way I treated my guilt, like it belonged in the dark." He turned to the preacher whose face had gone pale. "You want repentance?" There it is. When he finished, no one moved. A few heads lowered. Most just stared. Prudence clutched her shawl tighter, her lips pressed thin. Cale left without another word. He'd said what needed saying. Whether they heard it or not wasn't his to fix. The sun was sinking when he reached the ridge. He saw the shape of 2 figures ahead, a woman and a child, walking slow, hand in hand. Eleanor stopped when she heard the horse. She turned, dust swirling around her skirt. Maggie smiled before her mother could decide what to do. "Mr. Ryder," the girl called, her voice bright as the wind. Cale dismounted, holding the reins loosely. "Didn't figure you'd be on this road," he said softly. Eleanor's eyes met his, guarded, uncertain, but not cold. "Didn't figure you'd have reason to follow." He took a step closer, hat in hand. "Didn't follow. Just came to tell you something I should have said sooner." She waited. "I told them the truth, about the mine, about everything. Guess I got tired of letting the wrong folks carry my burden." Her expression changed, the hard edges softening. "You didn't owe me that. Maybe not. But I owed us a clean start, if you'll have it." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind through the grass. Maggie clung to her mother's skirt, looking between them like she understood more than she should. Finally, Eleanor said, "You sure this town's big enough for the both of us and our ghosts?" Cale smiled, small, tired, honest. "Ghosts don't scare me, ma'am. Empty houses do." Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Maggie reached for Cale's hand, and he didn't pull away. When they turned back toward the cabin, the sky was painted with gold and red, the kind of color that made even the roughest land look forgiving. By the time they reached the porch, the lamp inside was burning again, steady, warm. Waiting, Eleanor glanced at him once more. "You still think I belong here?" He nodded. "More than I ever did." And as the door closed behind them, the wind outside softened, carrying the dust of the past away. Inside, for the first time in a long time, the quiet meant home.